But there's there's good
We haven't
pizza.
done any major updates, but you are welcome to come again.
There's good pizza.
And the weather's nicer right now, and as we get into spring.
There you go. All added benefits.
Yeah, you probably don't want to do that tour on a muggy afternoon in August.
No.
Yeah, I think we went in the wintertime.
Yep.
Yeah, that was a good time.
Ed, it's 6:30. I am good to go on YouTube. You let me know when you want to go with the Zoom recording, and I'll be all set.
Let's just give it one more minute to see if the mayor and Ed Camacho join us.
Okay.
The mayor is planning to join.
Okay. Thank you, Tom.
You link?
Is it the right name? Is the name?
I don't see you up there.
Okay, the mayor has joined us. So Tom, why don't we go ahead and start the recording and get going?
You're good.
Okay, good evening and welcome to the April 16th special meeting of the Board of Estimate and Taxation. Madam Clerk, may we call a roll, please?
Mayor Rilling,
Here?
Mr. Abrams,
Here.
Mr. Camacho, Mr. Constant,
Here.
Mr. Gilleret,
Here.
Mr. Casimis, Miss Yang,
Here.
and Mr. Camacho. So 1, 2, 3, 4. We have 5. We have a quorum.
Thank you very much. All right. Before we get into our agenda this evening, Mr. Mayor, any opening remarks from you?
No, just as always, thank you everybody for their hard work. It's been a long, grueling process, but we're getting through it.
Great. Thank you very much. On our agenda tonight is the approval of the WPCA operating budget, the Parking Authority operating budget, the appointment of our auditors, and then the presentation discussion on capital and debt services. So Tom, do we want to go ahead and start with the WPCA budget?
Yes, I think that is a good call because I see Ralph and Vanessa here and do not see Parking Authority well, actually, no, I see one Parking Authority. So yes, you're good to go with WPCA.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Vanessa Valadares, Chief of
Do we have to
Operations.
move it, Ed? Do we have to move it, Ed? I'm
Oh,
not sure.
I'm sorry. Thank you, Troy. Thank you very much. Can I get somebody to move approval?
I'll move it.
This item? Thank you, Troy.
Hey, Ed.
Okay, so thank you.
Yes, there is.
Good evening, everyone. Vanessa Valadares, Chief of Operations and Public Works, and I'm here with
Okay.
Ralph.
Yeah, I didn't
So
get it either for some reason.
Yeah, Mr.
So we
Mayor, I'm
can-
sorry, you're not on mute.
I'll try to forward it to you. Oh, sorry.
So we're here to present the WPCA operating budget. I just want to remind everyone that the WPCA is an enterprise fund. And in the last many years, we have always been able to cover with the revenue all the expenses that we submit, and there is no change for this year. We are very confident based on the financial model that we implemented and we update annually, that we have no issues in cover our expenses. I just want to also remind you that what you guys are going to see on the operating budget was already presented to the WPCA board with the financial model, and they also approve the fee increase for this year that is 4.5%. What our financial model allows us to do is that every year we tweak the numbers accordingly to our needs, and we can see exactly where we're going to be in a 10-year period, and we can adjust as needed. So again, this year we ended up with a 4.5 flat fee that reflect about $18 on a residential property, and we're able to cover all the expenses. So what I'm gonna ask now Ralph to do is he's gonna go overall through what we are presenting on this operating budget, and we are here to ask to answer any other questions, and also invite you guys that you're always welcome to tour the wastewater treatment plant. Just reach out to us and we can give you guys a tour.
Just one moment. Ed Camacho never got the link. Could somebody send it to him?
I got it, Ed. That's all right.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa. Ralph Kolb, Senior Environmental Engineer for the Water Pollution Control Authority staff. One of the biggest line items in our operating budget is the operations and maintenance of the wastewater system. And that includes an 18 million gallon a day plant, 22 wastewater treatment pump stations, and 3 stormwater pump stations, and over 200 miles of collection system. So we're in our 4th year with Veolia, who's our contract operator, and we continue to utilize technology to continue to advance the Norwalk wastewater treatment plant in the country. Some of the ideas that we're doing at the treatment plant include enhanced nutrient and nitrogen monitoring for improved water quality. We continue to evaluate and rehabilitate tanks and equipment as needed. In this current fiscal year, the sludge blend tank number 1 was completely rehabilitated to provide a useful life of 20 to 30 years. We have a new scum filtrate processing enhancements that we've recently went online. And at the Killer Brook pump station, we're in the process of looking to upgrade and basically replace the old pump station. Question was, what's the condition of the force main? So we used the technology called a smart ball to send down the force main to gather information on the structural integrity of the force main, which is the pipe that conveys sewage for the pump station. And it turned out we do not have to replace it. So we're saving between $2 and $3 million based on utilizing that technology. Also, other technology that we've used is drone technology. So in our 60-inch east side interceptor, we flew a drone down to investigate. During that investigation, we found a building pile on Dascom's Lane that penetrated the pipe. With that information, we were then able to come up with a plan to remove the pile and rehabilitate the pipe to prevent potential SSOs, sanitary sewer overflows in the future, or have the river coming into the sanitary sewer. Recently, last week, Veolia and WPCA staff attended a conference in Hartford, collection system and stormwater conference. And Veolia presented on some of these new technologies that we're using at the plant or in the collection system. And other municipalities and consultants were very interested in what Norwalk is doing. In September of 2022, the WPCA submitted a collection system master plan to the Connecticut DEEP. Following a year later, in September of 2023, the team submitted a facility plan update for the treatment plant. These 2 plans basically give us a 5 to 10 year capital improvement program for our facilities, collection system and treatment plant. In February of this year, we had a very productive meeting with the state to talk about both of those plans and to get some initial preliminary feedback from them. And we'll continue to coordinate the discussion this year as they continue to evaluate and dig deeper into the plans. Several key operating budget line items that I want to call out that's included in my memo. Like Chief Vanessa said earlier, it's a rate increase of 4.5%, which is an increase of $18 per residential unit and $26 per commercial unit. And the flow rate is 46 cents per 1,000 gallons. Nitrogen credits, Norwalk is doing very well in the state. In 2022, we were the 5th best out of 78 municipalities to receive nitrogen credits. The 2023 information has not been submitted, so I don't know where Norwalk stands, but we are estimating that we'll receive around $30,000 in nitrogen credits. And lastly, on the revenue side, the WPCA provides services to the city of Norwalk, and we're invoicing just over $139,800. Now, on the expenditure side, like I mentioned earlier, Veolia is a large item on our operating budget. We estimate an increase of 3.5% due to inflation. We also, because the WPCA utilizes many city services, for example, finance, DPW engineering, we are actually reimbursing the city over $760,000 for those services. Want to also call out debt service payments are increasing due to ongoing capital improvements that we are planning over the next 5 and 10 years. And because of all those projects that are going to be coming online, we did include 2 new positions for fiscal year 24-25 to support the current and future projects. Now I'll open up to anybody that has any questions.
Thank
Yeah,
you,
hi, Ralph.
Before I open the floor to questions, let's just have the record show that Ed Camacho didn't join the meeting at 6:37 this evening. So sorry, Troy. Now, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ralph, a couple of quick questions. The vendor, you said it's in year 4. Is their line, their fee, their management fee, is that the line, the $10 million line? Is that their fee built into that, the operations and maintenance fees? Is that them?
That is correct.
And how long is the contract?
So the initial contract is good for 10 years with 2 5-year renewals.
Oh, so you're in year 4.
You were in year 4, that's correct.
And we're happy with them so far? I know they switched over 4 years ago when I
Yes. Yep. Yeah, we're very happy. When they signed on originally, it was Suez, and then Suez was bought out by Veolia, and we continue to be happy. And they're very supportive of the project. Corporate is, and we're trying to be one of the leaders in the wastewater industry using Veolia.
And the other question is on capacity. Where are we with capacity? And I know, and the capacity when you have those 2 or 3 major rainstorms, I think that's one of your criteria, right?
Yeah, so actually on the mayor's dashboard, we have a capacity analysis. So each month we upload our, what we call the 180-day rolling average. So the treatment plant is rated for 18 million gallons per day. At 90% of that capacity is 16.2 MGD. If our rolling 180-day average exceeds that number for an extended time, the city would have to submit a plan to the state within a year to either reduce flow or add additional treatment plant capacity, additional capacity at the treatment plant. What the team is doing, even though there's a lot of development, we are continuing to invest in our collection system and reduce infiltration and inflow, which is basically rainwater or groundwater that gets into the system and reduces capacity at the treatment plant. So right now we have, it's a little over a $4 million project. We have In Situ Form Technologies is in town, and they're in the process of lining about 50,000 feet of sanitary sewer pipe in the Bell Island and Sandwich Street. So that's the first of many projects that we're looking to bring forward over the next 10 years. Our goal is to line 25% of the collection system within those 10 years.
And also, so you know, the average in the past 180 days has been around between 12 and 13 MGD. So we are very below the 90% of the threshold that will trigger some type of updates.
So what was the capacity number you said, Ralph?
The treatment plant is 18 million gallons per day is the treatment plant capacity.
And where are we on the high point or average and then high points?
So our 3-year average, I believe, is 12 million gallons per day.
Oh, okay. And then when you have the big rainstorms, that obviously that adds a little more volume.
Correct. Like in the last 4 months with the big storms, our flow it's been elevated a little bit, but once we start getting into the drier season, our flows will come
pricing
down.
wise, or is up the price, or
Sorry, if you're not speaking, can you please make sure your phone is muted?
Right. Okay, so it sounds like we have excess capacity right now, comfortable capacity at the moment.
Correct.
We are.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Additional questions?
Yes, this is Anne. With the rate increase and the average fee being 18 residential, 26 commercial, is that competitive with other cities? So if someone was to say we're cheaper than another city or we're more expensive, how do we rank?
NACWA is an organization in the country that analyzes sewer fees. Also, I believe Ty and Bond does an annual analysis of various sewer fees for municipalities if they're willing to share. Typically, Norwalk is in the lower third of all in the Northeast for compared to local municipalities for sewer fees.
But say, for example, Bridgeport?
I don't know what their number.
We do not know their number, Ms. Ann, for this year, to be honest, but we know that we are not as high, particularly because we have a very good facility. We've been extremely efficient and we're keeping our costs very low. Some of the other plants, what we know is that they have been in trouble for not investing for many, many years. So now their investment, their operating cost has been very high, so they can maintain the requirements of the permit.
And the line item for reimbursement of city support services, how has that, what was it last year? Is it about the same every year?
Bear with us. So this year it's 763,653, and last year was 692,807.
And how is that calculated? Is it sort of a bit of a plug?
So finance actually helps us put this number together. It's a combination of multiple departments. It's finance, and that includes the financial team here on the call tonight. It includes the tax assessor's office, tax collector, because the WPCA does not bill sewer fees. We utilize city services. So the sewer fee is actually on the tax bill. So all the information is provided to the assessor and the collector, and then they incorporate that into the tax bill. Also includes IT services, so they fully support WPCA, and then some DPW and other departments. I even believe the mayor's office is part of that support as well.
Got it. Where are we in terms of our thinking on establishing a stormwater authority?
I think this is not related to the WPCA, Ms. Young, but what we are doing is that we have a consultant, CDM Smith, that they are putting a plan together and doing a preliminary financial model to see if it would be, I would say, how would be the right word? I would say they're putting the preliminary model together to help the city make the decision if the stormwater utility would be a good option for that. So we should be hearing back from them towards the end of the semester, and then we're going to do a presentation to present to the boards.
Great, thank you. One last question is, I know that there's you have a pipeline of pretty significant capital expenditures coming up. Can you talk about your future CapEx and what the projects are for?
Yes, we can. So just on a little bit of overall, besides those two major projects that Ralph touched on, some of our CapEx that we're expecting is about $152 million for the projected for the next 10 years. And that is based on the consent order that we send back to Connecticut Deep. So that's our commitment with Connecticut Deep, but we do not know if we're going to follow that plan because we are waiting for approval. And the idea is, as Ralph just suggested, we're going to be investing mostly of that money on our collection system to minimize all the infiltrations and then minimize the amount of flow that we're having here at the wastewater treatment plant. Besides that, we're going to be able to upgrade a couple of essential elements on the plant that is already reaching its, I would say, aging.
End of its useful life.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. I will say that the plant is, I've done a lot of plant tours over the years. I've never been to a wastewater treatment plant, but the plant was immaculate. So thank you for taking good care of a very important asset for the city.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And any additional questions for the WPCA?
Ed, if there aren't any, I just have one more quick question. How do you guys handle the schools and the city properties? Do they pay? Is there some type of exchange between the city?
No, they pay. That is that line of $139,000 that we're showing as a revenue. So that is the combination of all the city buildings and all the schools. They do pay for a sewer fee as everybody else.
Oh, okay, they do. Okay. Thank you.
Mhm.
Any last questions? Seeing none, can I get a show of hands? All in favor of approving the budget as presented, signify by saying aye. Opposed? Abstentions? The budget is approved. Thank you very much, Ralph. Thank you very much, Vanessa.
No, thank you. And we're waiting to hear from you guys if you want a tour.
Thank you.
We will let you know.
Okay, thank you.
Glass of water
Bye-bye.
at the end of the tour, right?
Yeah. All right. Tom, I guess our next item is the parking authority.
Yes, and we have Jim Travers and Sirach on the line to talk to that one. Gentlemen, you may take it away.
I'd like to move that, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Troy. You caught me twice. I promise I'll try and do better. Thank you. So moved.
Okay, so thank you, members. Just before we start, I just wanted to update on one item. It's a change from the budget summary that you have. We were given a new updated city sports charges from finance prior to this. I have been in touch with Tom, and Tom is going to send a new revised budget summary to you after the call, but wanted me to talk about it during the call. So I will refer to the second to the last item. So it's city support charges. All right, so that is so the reimbursement, the payment to the city is stated as $760,507. The payment for fiscal year 25 will be $853,506. Right, so it will move the fund balance to $218,000. So just for that point of clarification. Okay, so the budget so I think so the parking authority, I think, has worked very hard at coming back from COVID. I think we're showing an increase. We're seeing more activity that's happening inside the garage. Our transient activity continues to grow. We're seeing back to an increase of monthly parkers in our facilities. We're seeing an increase of the daily transient facilities. The activity in the city centers continues to be strong. The budget reflects those numbers, as well as the violations that are an unfortunate part of parking in a managed environment. But we do report to the Parking Authority Board on both monthly basis our percentage of violations to transactions run about 2%. Which is considerably below industry average, which is typically between 4 to 5%. So we continue to work with the local businesses on programs to support metered transactions, as well as assist them in some type of website services to move them into that. The item below there is the sales tax. Several years ago, the laws were changed, and we have to pay sales tax on the revenue for parking. That is the payment that is made to the state of Connecticut for parking. The other revenue that you see in the item below that is, you see that has gone up. We have fully leased the facilities for the first time in a while. So that reflects the increase of the leased facilities that have come in through there. You'll see in our expenses a slight increase in the payroll expenses. Our other operating expenses are keeping the assets in a state of good repair, right? We have budgeted in here for upgrades to the bathroom facilities in the Sono garage. We have some roof repair issues that we've identified that need to be done. Elevator repair is a constant, for us, but we have other things such as landscaping, snow removal. All of those fall into the other operating expenses. And then below that, again, the city, the payment that the parking authority makes to the city every year, this year again is going to be $853,506. That covers payroll. That covers any of the reimbursement for utilities. But largely, the largest percentage of that goes to cover payroll costs. And then below that is the parking authority's debt service. That number is given to us through finance. That's to pay down the long-term debt of the parking authority. So you'll see at the end when we minus revenue, when we minus expenses from revenue, it's left with a fund balance of $218,000, $218,512. So happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thank
I
you.
just have a
Question?
Mr. Chairman, I have a quick question. How many employees does that behavioral line encompass?
So
$1.8 million.
What?
I see the payroll line, other expenses, 1.8 million, 28. How many employees does that entail?
Sirach, do you have the employee count?
Yes, that's a total of 30 full-time equivalent employees.
30? 30?
Yes, 30, correct. Yep.
And you still use Laz, right? Is Laz the vendor that you use to run the systems?
So Laz is the current operator. We are currently out to bid for the contract has expired or will be expiring this year. So we are currently doing a bid to see if Laz shall remain or looking at what other services are out there. And there's a committee that's been established to review that.
And the other thing is capacity. I'm just curious, where are you compared to the pro-pandemic? I'm just curious, like it's Sono daily capacity, is it back?
So the garage itself continues to see an increase in monthly passes as well as transient. Right. The interesting thing that we're seeing that's occurring while we are, while we don't have the wait list that we had pre-pandemic, right? We are seeing, we are seeing higher numbers, increasing numbers for monthly passes. But what we're finding is those monthly passes aren't used 5 days a week, right? So they're used, 3 or 4 days a week. So we still tend to vary. We haven't filled up the garage. But we anticipate some of that will change as work gets done on the New Haven bound side, and we're going to need to move people into the facility. But the good news is it is increasing.
But there have been no sellouts. I mean, you haven't gone up since the pandemic. Before the pandemic, you used to drive up there. Sometimes there were no spaces available. You used to have to have a spillover lot, but that's not even close yet.
No, it's not. And it's not down anywhere down the line either. So this is pretty consistent. We have conversations with the operators and other municipalities up and down the line, and it's pretty consistent. We'll see, higher days when, when there's larger activity things that going on, when there's a parade in Manhattan, those things tend to drive more people, no pun intended, into the garage. But what we on the daily basis, no, we haven't seen the same level of occupancy as we had pre-pandemic.
Yeah, it definitely seems like I drive to New York a lot, and Mondays and Fridays are empty, and Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursdays are very busy, it seems. So I guess that reflects your business too.
Yeah.
The other thing is the capacity. Okay. Oh, are there there are a lot of competitors against Laz? I thought they were one of the biggest players.
So they are, but you're interviewing four of the candidates that have come through. So there's a number of players that are in the arena.
Good luck.
Thank you.
Additional questions?
Yes, I have a question, which is, which line items represents how Laz gets paid? Is it in the management fees, the service contracts, or is it sort of a percentage of overall expenses? What do they do and how do they get paid?
So the fee for the last parking fee, that gets covered in the expenses, but their fee is $100,000 a year.
And so I think Ms. Yang's question might be, which specific line item do we see that in?
There's a management fee.
Of the $100,000?
Yeah, it's
Yes.
the line item.
Yes.
But are these personnel and benefits, is there a markup for Laz to manage these people?
So no. So the contract is written that the parking authority pays all of the expenses, and we have a monthly reconciliation of those of the payroll expenditures that had occurred that month. So there's not a markup on top of that.
Okay, and they don't take any percentage of revenues or anything like?
No.
Thank you.
Any additional questions? Seeing none, all in favor of approving the budget as presented with the amendments that were called out by Jim at the front regarding the city support charges and the change in fund balance remaining, all signify by saying aye. Or yes. Aye. Opposed? Abstentions? The budget as amended is approved. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you,
Thank
Jim.
you. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
The next item on our agenda is the appointment of the auditors for FY24. Before we discuss this, can I get it moved for discussion and vote, please? Thank you, Kendrick.
Yeah, so this is something we do every year. Around this time of year, we have to report to the state who we're using for our auditors for the upcoming completion of the fiscal year. And we have Chitsmay Lamb on the line to talk to this one.
Yes, per Connecticut state statute, we're required to report to the State Secretary of the Connecticut Office of Policy and Management 30 days prior to the end of our fiscal year who our auditors would be. I know a little bit of the background. In 2020, during COVID year, we went out to RFP for audit service. And at the time, we selected Bloom Shapiro for a 5-year contract starting with the fiscal year 2020 audit. So this year, fiscal year 2024, this will be their 5th year with the city, and we would like the board to approve this appointment for them to audit our fiscal year 2024 financial report.
Okay. Questions from anyone?
Just a quick question from me, Troy. Is there an escalation every year, or is it a flat fee for the 5 years of $103,000?
That is the fee that we built into the contract. So for FY24, this is $103,000, and that cost is split between the city and the Board of Education.
Okay. Thank you.
Additional questions? Seeing none, all in favor of approving the auditor as recommended by the city, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? That item is approved. Thank you, Chitsame.
Yeah.
All right. The next item on our agenda is presentation and discussion around the capital budget and debt services. I'm not certain if a informational update like this needs to be moved for discussion, but just out of safety and for purposes of being complete, can I get a motion to bring this discussion to the floor, please? Thank you, Ann. All right, Tom.
Yeah, so in response to some of the questions that we got from the BET in terms of how we handle this whole process, what it looks like in terms of coming up against any thresholds or ratios that might cause concern, and most of all, how to preserve and maintain our AAA credit rating the best way possible, especially in light of some of the major school construction projects that are coming up. So Bill Lindsay is our bond advisor, and we have picked his brain pretty well over the last week to 10 days. But he has been kind enough to put together this presentation and walk us through this. So without any further ado, Bill, you may take it away.
Great. Thank you, Tom. And Tom, are you able to share the presentation?
I am about to.
Excellent. Thank you. So good evening again. My name is Bill Lindsay. I work for Munistat Services out of our Madison, Connecticut office. And I wanted to, walk you through a few things, with respect to, the credit rating process, where the city is currently with respect to its, its debt position, the amount of debt that debt load that it currently has, as well as what's been proposed and what the potential implications are from a credit perspective. So with that, Tom, I think you're gonna advance the slides, correct?
Yes. So you just tell me when. Just say next slide, and I'll take it away.
Yeah. Perfect. So if you go to the next slide.
Okay.
So this is just an overview of what plan to discuss with you all this evening. So wanted to first just kind of touch on what credit ratings are and what the purpose of them are and the particulars of them. Talk about credit rating methodologies, because unfortunately they all three of the agencies have a different methodology. We're going to get into what the city's current debt position is, as well as what authorized but unissued balances are, and then what the potential impact of those borrowings may be on the credit. And then look at and then give you an assessment of where the city's credit is currently and where it may be going. And then I wanted to talk to you about concept or the proposed use of bond anticipation notes, which are they're certainly not a new option that is available under Connecticut statutes, but it's one that the city hasn't historically utilized because of its healthy level of reserves. We're able to finance projects internally, the cash flows internally, but with the size of the projects that are on the board and are upcoming, it felt like it's a good time to have this conversation, because short-term notes or bond anticipation notes, are a tool that a number of Connecticut issuers have been using, help cover cash flow, help cover state reimbursement, which we'll talk about, and the state retainage or withholdings they have for school construction projects. So Tom, if you go to the next slide. All right. So, from a high level, we wanted to just kind of say, what are municipal credit ratings and what are they not, right? Because there's a couple of things here that may be, a surprise to you folks. And so first, municipal credit ratings are a measure of credit risk, which is another way of saying what is the likelihood of the issuer to pay its obligations, to repay the bonds. Okay. That measure of credit risk, though, is at a point in time, and it is subject to change based on changing credit conditions. And so it's important to keep that in mind, that the city is, historically maintain a certain rating. That's not guaranteed going forward, that the underlying credit conditions are going to determine what that rating may be. It's kind of the reason why we're having this conversation tonight. One of the things that may be a surprise to you all, though, is that the credit assessment is of the entire entity that is the city. So that includes both the city side government, Board of Education, as well as the enterprise funds. So the folks that you heard from and budgets that you just approved a little bit earlier tonight. I know that in Connecticut statutorily, the boards of education have a certain degree of autonomy, but from a credit perspective, the rating agencies are viewing the Board of Ed as just another department of the city. So when they talk about the city, they're talking about it holistically. It's a broader view of the city. What the credit ratings are not is, they're not a recommendation to invest in the bonds. Importantly, they're not a guarantee though of the credit quality, because as we said, it is subject to change based on underlying credit conditions. And it's not an assessment of specific elected officials or specific staff. Again, they're viewing the city holistically, right? And so it isn't intended to be, when we talk about financial management, it isn't necessarily intended to be about the finance department in and of itself. It's the overall financial management of the entity. If you could go to the next slide.
Got it?
Thank you. So here, what I wanted to talk about here on this slide is that each of the credit rating agencies, and there are 4 major credit rating agencies, they all evaluate the risk based on their own developed methodology. There's not, unfortunately, a standard that's put forth by the SEC about what credit rating agencies will use for their own individual criteria. They're developing them individually, and each one is going to weigh on certain credit factors differently. So that makes this conversation about what the impact of the city's credit rating from, when we talk about, say, the debt load, a little more complicated, because each of these credit rating agencies are different, and the city uses 3 of them. So that's important to keep in mind as we go through this discussion. As you're aware, the city does have AAA ratings from Fitch, Moody's, and S&P. We're going to focus mainly on Moody's and S&P in the next few slides, because there are some similarities here. But when we take a little bit deeper dive, I'm going to speak more towards the Moody's methodology, because the Moody's methodology tends to be the limiting methodology of the 3. We tend to see higher ratings from Standard & Poor's and Fitch because of their focus more on management, where the city scores very well. So we're going to focus a little bit more on the Moody's one, because they're really the weakest link, if you will, among the three rating agencies. So specifically to Moody's and S&P, they both use what they term as a scorecard approach. What that means is they employ a weighted average of certain key factors, and I'll tell you what those are in a moment, to develop what they refer to as an indicative rating. And then they take that indicative rating and they adjust it for certain overriding factors. So here the analyst does have a certain degree of flexibility to go in and make adjustments, and that will then determine what the final rating is. So the next few slides, I'll walk you through both Moody's and S&P scorecard, and you get a sense as to what I mean by that. You could go to the next slide. Thanks, Tom. So here, this is Moody's scorecard. And so I want you to focus or draw your attention on the left-hand side to those, really the first 4 bubbles there, where these are the key credit factors that they're evaluating. So economy, financial performance, institutional framework, and leverage. Those are the 4 areas. And I'll talk about each one briefly. The circles to the right of that, though, define what the weightings are. So economy, financial performance, and leverage all are 30% weights. And then finally, institutional framework makes up the balance at 10%. What's important and a little bit counterintuitive is that leverage measure that Moody's uses is a measure of all the liabilities of the city. So pension, OPEB, and debt all on equal footing. So it's a little bit counterintuitive in that we go to the credit rating agencies when you issue debt, we think of it as a debt rating, but debt only makes up a 10% weight or only carries a 10% weight under Moody's methodology. So there are other factors that are more important and are bigger drivers of the rating, and I'll talk about those in a moment. Just to walk through each of these individually, economy at 30%, they're measuring resident income, so median family income. They're measuring full value per capita and then economic growth in terms of changes in the grand list. So here, these are areas where the city scores very well. And I'll show you the final scorecard in a moment, and you can see what developing very high ratings for those metrics. Next is financial performance, where they measure fund balance and then what they refer to as a liquidity ratio, which is really cash. What's important to keep in mind here is under Moody's methodology, they're not just looking at the general fund. They're looking at all governmental funds. So it's more of a government-wide approach. That includes things like the Internal Service Fund, as well as both enterprise funds. This also has been a benefit to the city, and the city scored very well here, because in addition to having healthy reserves in the general fund, there's also strong reserves in the Internal Service Fund and the WPCA. Institutional framework. So this is a measure of the statutory and legal framework that the city operates in within the state of Connecticut. So here Moody's is looking at the statutes and saying, or developing one score for all 169 issuers within the state. So Norwalk is getting a AA score, and so is every other town and city in the state of Connecticut. And then finally, leverage. Again, it's equal footing on for debt, pension, and OPEB. The city's pension and OPEB liabilities are very well funded, so that's a strength. So when we think about the concern with respect to the debt load, there are other stronger areas that are helping to offset maybe that what could be viewed as an area of weakness. And then finally, the notching factors. Here, this is the ability for the analyst to make adjustments. And the print's a little fine or small at the bottom, so I don't know if you can read those, but this is where they would take that indicative rating, that indicative scorecard rating. There we go. Thank you, Tom. And then developing what would be the final headline rating that we're used to. So again, they're looking at what other things exist that when they go to compare the city to other issuers across the state, across the region, across the country that try to make up some of the differences. So if you can go to the next slide, Tom. So here now, this is Standard & Poor's scorecard rating. So there's some similarities. I'll point those out, and there's some differences. This is, I labeled this slide their current scorecard. In late last year, S&P came out with a proposal to revise their local government criteria. It has not taken effect yet, so I'll show you where those changes are in a moment. But this is what S&P has been using since 2016. Again, what I want to help give you a sense as to the fact that this is a composite. These ratings are a composite. There's a number of factors that go into it. It's not just debt. So here for S&P, you see the same institutional framework with the same 10% score. Economy, again, same kind of measures, 30% score. I'm going to skip over management and come back to it. Next, they have finances. So again, 30% score, similar to Moody's. The difference here is that S&P is taking the debt and what they call debt contingent liabilities, and they've reduced that down to 10%. And they've taken that 20%, and they're now using that to measure management. So they're trying to get a sense as to what is the financial management of the entity, how do they go about developing their budgets? Do they report their financials timely? What are their policies and procedures? And they've added a pretty high weight at 20%. And this is why, this is an area where I should say where the city has scored very well under this financial management. And it's a reason why we're say less concerned about the Standard & Poor's rating because of that management factor and the city's, historic strength in that area. So if you could go to slide 7, Tom. So now this is what their proposed scorecard would look like. So here now they've broken it into 5 factors. And so economy, financial performance, reserves and liquidity, management again, and then debt and liabilities across the top, each one with equal weighting at 20%. So here they took 10% away from economy and are moving it over to debt and liability. Financial performance, they've broken that out versus reserves and liquidity. Management still remains at 10%, but the increase to debt and liabilities. So looking at the way that they've broken this out and the fact that they've maintained a 20% weighting for management, that is something that we feel, the city will benefit the city, will work in the city's favor, just again, based on, strong performance in that area. So Tom, if you could go to the next slide. So here, we've given you the kind of the background of how the rating agencies develop the credit rating. With the important takeaway is it's not just a debt measure, that there's a number of factors that play into how they develop this rating. And I think it bears repeating here, with the Moody's methodology, with debt, pension, and OPEB being on equal footing, debt really only represents a combined 10%. And the city's historically well-funded pension and OPEBs are offsetting that, what the current and future debt load is or is expected to be. So the city's discipline in those areas and funding those historically, is providing a benefit here. But really, the one of the main pillars or foundations of the city's historic AAA rating is on the financial side, and that's in part due to this body and the way you go about developing conservative budget practices, maintaining strong reserves, having strong policies. And again, it's important to bear in mind that this is not just a general fund measure any longer, but it's government wide. It includes internal service fund and the enterprise funds. So if you go to the next slide, please. Right. So here, this is the Moody's scorecard from last August. So this was right out of the Moody's report here. And again, I wanted to point out a couple things here. You can see the factors on the left and the measures that they are the metrics that they're using, I should say. You could see the measure score, which we don't need to get into that, how they calculate them specifically. The weights are important, but I think the scores on the far right is the important takeaway here. In order to have an overall AAA rating, it does not mean the city needs to score at AAA for every single metric. So there are certain metrics where they're scoring AAA. I believe there's 4 of them. Two under economy, 1 under finances, and then 1 in leverage. But there are others where the city's scoring AA. There's 3 of those, and then 1 single A for economic growth. I'll say this about the economic growth metric. This is one of the areas that I have an issue with Moody's, the way they've developed this methodology. What they're doing here is they're comparing the GDP of the region, so the Bridgeport-Stanford MSA, to national GDP, which unfortunately works against Connecticut issuers in general, in this case the city specifically, because it's a 5-year measure, so we're picking up COVID years. 1 and 2, really for the last few decades, Connecticut has lagged GDP metrics compared to the rest of the nation. So it's unfortunately not in my mind, not a great measure. I like the other two measures much better, resident income and full value of the grand list on a per capita basis. These are areas where the city and Fairfield County in a larger sense score very well. That's why there's AAA scores. But, again, this is Moody's methodology. This is a framework we have to operate in. Just give you a sense as to why that number is what it is. But again, what I want to draw your attention to is at the bottom is that scorecard indicated outcome is, again, based on their metrics, they're coming up with a AA2 rating based on just the inputs that you see here and the scores you see here. But the analyst is able to make below the line adjustments. And that brings the overall assigned rating up to AAA. And so, that's a pretty big spread to go from AA2. It's two notches from AA2 to AA. And so, I wanted to, one, bring that to your attention, two, kind of try to explain why that is. And so I put a quote from Moody's report at the bottom. Really what they're saying here is that the city's long history of financial and economic stability and performance is the factors that they're adjusting in a positive way to raise the scorecard indicated outcome from AA2 to AAA. All right. But again, I think the important takeaway here is you don't need to score AAA on every single metric. If we've got metrics that are weaker, as long as we've got offsetting stronger metrics, right, that should be enough to help bring the overall rating up to the level that we're looking for. All right, if you go to the next slide. So here, sticking with Moody's criteria, now we're going to kind of get into the current debt situation. So here, a couple of things that are important to remember. One, the measure is principal only. Okay, so they're not using interest. It's just an outstanding principal balance. One. Two, I mentioned on the financial side, they're looking at a government-wide perspective. So not just the operating fund. So they're not just using the general fund debt here. They're looking at all of the debt, including the enterprise funds. Again, I said that Moody's methodology is kind of a limiting factor. Standard & Poor's and Fitch will both make adjustments to the debt load based on the understanding that the historic performance of the two enterprise funds is that they're self-supporting, that the city hasn't needed to subsidize them in quite a few years. And so they recognize that and will back that out. Moody's isn't doing that under their scorecard currently. So we're going to look at this from a citywide perspective. So as of June 30 of 24, the city's outstanding debt load will be $435 million. Okay. I think one of the things that it's important to keep in mind is that you're retiring between 33 and 34 million a year. The average, if you look at principal payment in 25, 26, and 27 is about 33 million on average. So the city is paying down a significant amount of debt. So as it brings on new debt issuances, we're not going to be getting to this debt capacity that I'm going to speak to in a moment, directly with the new issuance. They are taking into account the rate of retirement, and so there's a net amount. The important takeaway from that is that the distance between today and say when we hit this, what I'm calculating to be the debt capacity or maximum, there's a few years in there because there is a net increase in that debt. It's not just the amount that's issued in one single year. So you may recall that worked with Henry Dakowitz about 3 years ago back, and I think it was 21 to kind of come up with an estimate of what that debt capacity may be, where we feel that the ratings may start to be in jeopardy. And at the time, we said it was about $400 million. A couple of things have changed since then. One, Moody's revised their methodology in late 22, early 23. And so once that methodology was changed and they're taking this more of a government-wide view of the city. We were able to increase that capacity number because of, as I said, because of the strong funding in the pension and strong funding in the OPEB on equal footing with the debt, as well as strong reserves outside of the general fund. So that those we're able to say, okay, because those are credit strengths, we can, the debt capacity would likely come up. Subsequent to that, now that the city's 23 audit has been published and there's continued strong performance, $5 million surplus in the general fund, OPEB is currently at an overfunded position, which is frankly unheard of in Connecticut. And having a year of dealing with Moody's new methodology, including the credit rating calls last August, I feel now that that number can be increased to $650 million. Okay. So if the cap is 650 million, the city is at 435 million. That's about 165 million dollar delta between when this rating may be in jeopardy versus where the city is now. It's important to keep in mind that the city has about $155 million authorized but unissued debt currently. But the metric that Moody's is looking at is not what's been approved, it's what's been issued. And so we'll talk about authorized but unissued next. But to the extent that the new issuance can be phased in, that annual retirement of roughly $33 million helps bridge buy some time, if you will, because we're not looking at a straight, increase based on the size of the capital budget. It's a net increase when we take into account the amount that's being retired annually.
Go
All right,
ahead.
if we could go to the next slide. Actually, Tom, if you just go back for 1 second. So I think I misspoke there. It's 650 million was what I'm calculating now versus a combined 590. So we've got more room than I think I said. It's more like about $60 million delta than what I think I indicated there. So just something to keep in mind. But if you could go to slide 11. All right, so here, this is a breakdown of the current authorized but unissued debt by capital budget year. And so you can see there's some older legacy projects that are still have authorization. The majority of them are really in the last 4 years. And we've indicated, that 2021 capital budget year, that included a portion of the South Norwalk Neighborhood School and Norwalk High School in there. So this is the detail on the 155 million. But what I think for me, the takeaway is that, again, Moody's is not measuring what's been authorized. They're measuring what's been issued. And the city's practice has not been to issue the full amount of the bond authorization in the year following its issuance. There are considerations like, timing of the project's design, engineering, those things take time. And so again, we'll try to demonstrate this on the next slide, that the authorizations aren't what they're necessarily looking at. It's what will the city be issuing in each of the next 3 years. And historically, it hasn't been the complete amount of the authorization or the complete amount of the capital budget. If you go to the next slide, Tom. So here, again, we don't have, or the project cash flows for the major projects are still being, developed. So what I try to do here is at a high level is give you a sense as to what that kind of timing is based on, what is in the 5-year capital plan and when we may exceed my estimate for that debt capacity number. again, there's a couple of things that's important to keep in mind here. So really what I did, I started, this is just the, beginning balance, additions, reductions, ending balance, waterfall. With respect to the additions first, I'm amortizing that 155 million over 5 years. It's a straight line amortization. That's probably not how it's going to play out. It's going to depend on the timing of the projects. Norwalk High School in particular, there's included in those costs are demo for the old school, right? It isn't that you have to build a new school first. So we know there's a little bit of time built into that. Absent, cash flows, that this was as good of a indication as anything. Again, the new capital column here, this is what's in the 5-year plan, and it assumes issuance in the same year as the authorization within the plan. But historically, that's not been the case. And so I feel like realistically, the spending is going to push this out a little bit, especially with the larger authorizations that include the school projects in 26 and 27. I don't know if it's reasonable to assume those are all going to go off at the same time concurrently, but in an effort to be conservative, we've given you kind of a worst case scenario, assuming that the bonds do get issued in the year that they're authorized. And then with respect to reductions here, you can see where it's starting out at about 33 million in the upcoming year. Obviously we're bringing on more debt than we're retiring. So the annual reduction amount, it's i.e. debt service, this is the principal portion only, is going to go up. And you can see why that's growing over time, because the issuance is exceeding what is being reduced on an annual basis. But using this approach, when we get to 26, 27, the ending balance would be $770 million, excuse me, which would be in excess of the estimate of 650 million. But again, it's important to keep in mind that this is just one of the credit factors. It doesn't guarantee that there'll be a credit rating change. There are other things, there are other considerations, including growth in the grand list, which is projected to be healthy, as well as continued positive operating performances as fund balance continues to if fund balance continues to grow, that would take into account, would allow for, I should say, a slightly higher debt load. The one positive offsetting this one area of weakness. All right, so that was what we had put together with respect to what the concerns would be, given the amount of debt that's proposed in the capital plan. But again, I want to provide the caveat that we don't yet have project level cash flows, and so the timing of this is really based on what the information we have available to date, which again is probably is conservative on a worst case scenario, and probably not realistic as to how this will actually transpire. But in order to give you something to think about and present, we took a conservative approach there.
Bill, this is Troy real quick. What is the fund? I didn't see fund balance on your slides there. What is the fund balance, the active fund balance right now?
So if we could go back to a few slides to the Moody's scorecard, which was 9.
I'm there.
So yeah, so here, if you could blow that up again, the metric that they're using is government wide, right? So it's 27.5% of total revenues. Total governmental revenues, that is. In terms of actual dollars, it would be $140 million. But keep in mind, that's not just unassigned in the general fund. That's committed, assigned, and unassigned fund balance at the governmental funds, plus unrestricted assets in the Internal Service Fund, WPCA, and Parking Authority.
What would it be just for the cities without those two other things?
Yeah, sorry.
it's like 78 million unassigned, I believe.
Yeah, 78.5 was as of the audit last year.
Right.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, so if you want to jump back ahead, Tom, thank you. Back to slide 14. So one of the things I wanted to talk to you about this evening was, kind of some mitigating steps that the city could consider to help manage the cash flows for these large projects. And some of them have very large state reimbursement, which is great, but unfortunately, in practice, the state hasn't always been timely in providing that reimbursement, and they do have 5% withholdings in the form of retainage, so that when we're talking about significant amounts of state aid, particularly on Norwalk High School, it adds up. And so what I wanted to talk to you about is, and actually, let's go back one slide, Tom. I apologize. I gave you the wrong number. Just to kind of talk about short-term borrowing at a high level, and then we can, if we go to 13, there we go, and then talk about it a little more specifically here. So, state statutes do allow municipalities to borrow on a short-term basis. They can issue short-term notes in advance of certain types of revenues. The most common practice is what we call bands or bond anticipation notes, and you're issuing these short-term notes in anticipation of bonding. So we would have a bond authorization in place. We could issue notes for up to 2 years in a single issuance, so they can span 24 months. But historically, municipalities issue them every 12 months. They can be renewed annually. If they're issued annually, they can be renewed 10 times. If they're issued for the full 24 month, they can be issued 5 times, rolled over 5 times. And then the idea here is when the notes mature, they are retired from proceeds of whatever that revenue is that the notes were issued in anticipation of. So historically, it's bond anticipation notes or bands, but there's also RANs or revenue anticipation notes, tax anticipation notes or TANs. We have an office in the state of New York, and the state of New York has a disconnect between the fiscal year for the local governments and the state, so that they don't always match up. They issue a lot of TANs on a every year. And there's also really what we would call GANs or grant anticipation notes. And I think that's what I want you to kind of take away from this conversation is we could use these short-term notes as really grant anticipation notes if we want to help provide liquidity during construction and not have to leverage the city's underlying liquidity, which is very strong. But the concern would be, listen, if we're going to be taking on more debt, and that is a perceived quote unquote weakness from a credit perspective, we want to maintain strength in the other credit factors as much as we can. And leveraging the city's debt, if we draw that down at any particular June 30th, and we show less strength on the balance sheet, that has credit implications. So we want to try to keep that liquidity high as a credit strength when we're issuing more debt, which is a quote unquote weakness.
This is Ann. Bill, I have a number of questions on the terms. Shall I wait until you're finished with your presentation to go through some questions?
Yeah, maybe I think that might be a good idea because if we only have a 1 or 2 slides left, and I could try to give you an overview of what more specifics, I should say, of the bond anticipation notes and how they would be useful. And then
so Bill, go ahead and finish your
Okay.
prepared remarks, and then we'll get into a Q&A if that's okay with everybody.
Right. So Tom, if we go to 14.
Good.
I'm still seeing the next slide. Yeah, there we go. Right. So here on the bond anticipation notes now. So this has become a more common practice across the state as to help manage cash flows for these large larger construction projects. As these projects have gotten larger and more expensive, state retainage, 5% of the grant withholdings, has become a larger amount of money. So we have a number of issuers who issued these short-term notes to help put funding in place so they're not drawing down their own fund balance temporarily to cover the state's portion of the project cost. So we could issue the notes during construction. Again, the state's going to be reimbursing the city in the form of progress payments during construction, but there's a lag there. It could be 60 days. It could be as long as 90 days. And so this will help, I think, provide some liquidity to the city. Think of it as a construction loan. The city doesn't necessarily need to bond it at the end at maturity. We could use the grants when they do come in to pay off the notes when they mature. We've done this in a number of places, specifically Guilford and Groton. Groton has had a $200 million school program that was recently completed, but they still have about $12 million of notes outstanding that represent the state retainage on the project. And we've rolled them over now. This is the second year in a row we've rolled them over. As soon as the state finishes the post-project audit, the revenues come in, we use that to retire the notes. One of the other areas where the notes could be helpful, and this is being done in both Greenwich and Darien, is to help phase in the budgetary impact of the new debt. So this will allow you to buy, some time until you have to issue the bonds. So in the case of Darien, you probably read in the paper that they purchased that piece of property for $85 million in Darien. We didn't issue $85 million in bonds in year one. We issued half of the cost in bonds and the other half in short-term notes. When the notes matured a year later, we're issuing bonds for the second installment. So we're using the notes to help buy some more time, retire more of the existing debt, so we don't have such a large increase in the budgetary impact. The one thing I'll remind you here is that if we're talking about bond anticipation notes, we need to have a bond authorization in place to issue those. We may be temporarily issuing to cover the state's portion of costs. We can't bond for that under state statute, but we can make short-term temporary borrowings for that. But we may need to increase bond authorizations if only the net amount was originally authorized. Just something to think about as we move forward. And then Tom, if you could go to the last slide.
Sorry, there's about a 10 to 12 second lag from what I'm seeing until what you guys see on your screen.
Yeah, so here I wanted to just kind of talk about conclusions here. So I think a couple of things. The foundations of the city's AAA ratings historically have been both economic strength of the city and then the financial stability of the city, right? So those strong reserve levels, well-funded pensions, and well-funded OPEB offset what would be an increase in the debt. But if that one credit factor, becomes weaker, right? It's that much more important to have strength in the other credit factors. So future financial performance, because it's a 30% weight under Moody's methodology, is going to have a more significant impact than on the rating than the debt, because debt just, simple math, debt's only 10% of the rating. So it's important to maintain those fund balance levels. And that's why I think cash and fund balance levels. And that's why I'm saying, hey, maybe we could use these short-term borrowings to help spread out the impact and provided external liquidity instead of using the city's internal liquidity, so that the balance sheet looks better. And that helps offset some of the weakness with a larger debt load. So that was my presentation. So I guess, Mr. Chairman, if you want to move to the Q&A piece, I'd be happy to answer questions.
Absolutely. But before we get to Q&A, Jared, any comments you want to add as the city CFO before we get to Q&A?
Yes, Mr. Chair, thank you very much for
giving me the opportunity. Most of it will be to reinforce what Bill said, and then a couple other points that I wanted to make too. You know, it's a not uncommon discussion to have in municipalities. Other towns do this too, where you see the bottom line authorizations, bond authorizations, and to make the jump to say that this is, read into that to say that this is what we're going to issue, and typically that's not the case. And every year we come back and revisit this, which is why we do a capital plan every year. And a lot of those authorizations end up being pushed out, smoothed out, re-examined, and to make it work so that the amount of issuance is not a 1-for-1 with what's being authorized or what's in the capital plan. We're also going to be making, this is going to take some more time, but making some more efforts to identify grant projects that are going to be eligible for grants, which would also help to bring down the authorizations and in the long run the issuance as well, to put those in, bake those into the capital plan and for the projects that we believe are going to be either going to be or have a high likelihood of getting a grant. And then with regard to the authorized unissued, I'd go maybe one step further and say that yes, those may get spread out they will get spread out over multiple years. They're not going to all hit at once. In addition to that, I think there's been some evidence and some history, not just in Norwalk, but that some of those authorizations end up being reallocated to other projects, and the underlying and previous authorization ends up either falling away or being reallocated somewhere else. But those, in many instances, it wouldn't be uncommon for some of those projects to be reallocated to something else, which helps our debt situation in the long run. And thank you again, Mr. Abrams, for the opportunity to talk.
Thank you, Jared. Let's go ahead and open it up for questions. I'm sure there are a number of questions.
Ed, this is Troy. Can I just start off with a quick couple of questions? Bill, you didn't mention interest rates in the whole presentation. You said you were just concerned about repayment of principal. How do rising or lowering interest rates play in the models that you have presented with the agencies?
It's a good question. The rating agency's model doesn't really factor that in, so that wasn't what we factored. I think with respect to rising interest rates, it's important to keep in mind all the debt's fixed rate, so it's fixed at the time it's issued. That it's not floating rate. So as rates are rising, it's not adversely affecting your outstanding debt load. Right, those rates are all fixed. What it will affect is going forward. To the extent that rates are declining, all of the city's bonds have optional call provisions included in them, and that's at the city's option only. So we can refinance those outstanding bonds that may have been issued at higher rates once rates do begin to come down. And we've done this. The city's been very active of doing this historically. And so, we would expect to have opportunities to do that once the Fed starts cutting and rates start coming down.
So based on your presentation and based on the model that you presented, it seems like with the addition of the short-term financing options you've given us, that my original question was regarding the AAA status and the additional school debt. And I know the model you presented was overloaded for 1 year, for those large amounts. Sounds like we are in a good position to be able to withhold at the moment keep our AAA rating based on this model you presented. Is that a fair estimation?
Yes, I think it is. I think currently that's the case. I think to Jared's statements, I think it's important to continue to be prudent, as the city has historically been, in examining the authorized but unissued projects and projects that have been revised or abandoned or come in under budget. If you could take those authorizations and reallocate them to other or future projects, that helps bring down what you will issue in the future. I think that's a necessary and prudent approach, and that the city's historically undertaken. And I think, though, it's important to keep in mind that we, as I said before, the credit ratings are a point in time. So at this point in time, I don't see it's not in jeopardy. But it isn't to say 3-4 years from now that we need to revisit this analysis again. And it's important to keep in mind. You asked the question about fund balance. We need to be cognizant of both the fund balance as well as the debt load, because they've historically offset one another, one being a credit positive and one being a credit weakness. Fund balance starts to become depleted or isn't been replenished. Appropriated fund balance for tax relief isn't replenished as it historically has been. That is going to, potentially add pressure to the rating, because we're viewing that as a credit positive to offset what, could be a credit negative from a higher debt borrowing.
I know it's helping us being overfunded in our pension plan, but are we being much too conservative with the way we're funding that?
I wouldn't say so. I mean, I think in terms of the pension, I think one, there's an expectation as a AAA credit, you're going to fund it at the recommended level. You're required by charter to do that anyway, so you don't really have a lot of flexibility there. But that's the expectation of the rating agencies, and you've historically met that expectation. So I wouldn't recommend a change there. On the OPEB side for the post-employment benefits, we've got 64 clients in Connecticut, and you're the only one who's overfunded for pension. So
that was the one I meant. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So you stand out there very much so, and have for a while, because you've been well ahead of the curve with respect to that funding level. So I wouldn't necessarily change that, the current practice or the current policy, because it's working in your favor.
Thank you.
Thank you, Troy. Ms. Yang?
Tom, would you mind pulling the presentation back up and going to the conclusions slide?
Before Ms. Yang continues, I have to go walk my very young dog, or else he'll have an accident, which I don't want. So I'm going to check out. I assume there's no vote at today's meeting. So
no, this was an informative presentation only. There's no vote.
Great. All right. I appreciate the presentation. It was quite informative. Thank you.
So, Bill, and first off, thank you for this presentation. It's been very interesting, very helpful. And I know you've been our bond advisor for a long time. And so thank you for the good advice that you've given us over the years. Okay, if we look at the first bullet point and the last bullet point, strong liquidity reserves, well-funded pension, and OPEB. So I get the well-funded pension, but on the bottom you say that liquidity and reserve levels are already low relative to sector medians. So how do we think about this liquidity issue?
Bill, you want me to take this since I asked the same thing a few hours ago?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, so basically, when they look at us, the city, they don't just look at Fairfield County or Connecticut, they look at the national level. And in certain parts of the country, the reserves and are much, much higher. I think our reserve level is somewhere in the high teens. That 78.5 that I mentioned before out of the total operating budget, which is very, very high for Connecticut. But if you look at, California or parts of the Southwest and other places, it's not unusual to have 25% or more for their reserves. So when you compare it on a national level, yeah, we look like we're laggards.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple of things there. I added that final bullet, I guess, as a bit of a, I don't know, warning, for lack of a better term, simply because if you go back to the slide 9 that had the Moody's scorecard, and the scorecard indicated rating came out at AA2, and they bumped the headline rating to AAA. And the reason, if I focused on the positives in their statement, is to explain why they raised the scorecard indicated rating to AAA, which was the history of the financial and economic stability. I didn't focus on the negative, which is their view, not my view, but their view, that cash and reserves are low relative to the sector median. And so, the fact that that metric is at a AA score right now, the reason why it's not a AAA score is because when they revised their methodology, that because they're looking on a government-wide level, they bumped up the breakpoints. And so I think it's just important to keep in mind that we all have a Connecticut-based focus, right? Because we're in Connecticut, we're thinking about Connecticut and how we line up with our Connecticut peers. But to Tom's point, relative to the rest of the country, the fund balances in Connecticut are historically low. And the reason why it's accepted from the credit rating agencies is because, one, you rely on a stable property tax that isn't going to be as volatile as, say, sales tax would be during the ups and downs in the business cycle. And then two, you deliver all of your services locally. So you don't have county level of government or a school district or a fire district that's going to levy an assessment on the city for services that you don't really have direct control over. And so because you deliver those services locally and you're relying on a stable revenue base, they say you don't need to have quite as high a level of reserves as you may in other jurisdictions that don't have those two underlying credit strengths. So I put that last bullet in there to kind of refer back to what Moody's was saying here, that listen, you are low relative to your national peers. And this is an issue that Connecticut has always had. In my 25 years of doing this, it's always been a conversation. Right now, it's not a concern for the city. But if the reserve and cash levels drop, it could become an issue going forward. And so that final bullet was just more of a caveat, if you will.
So, Bill, would it be fair to oversimplify your statement to say, look, we should feel good about our liquidity and reserve levels compared to our fellow municipalities in the state, but we should not feel overconfident given where we are when we compare nationally, and feel that that is an area that we can play with in any way, shape, or form? Is that a fair kind of recap?
Yes. No, I think that's very well said.
Thank you. Sorry, Ms. Yang, I know you had other questions.
Yeah, and maybe this is a request and a question for Tom. Could we please have a schedule which calculates this liquidity reserve? Because when I look at the balance sheet, there's cash, there's investments. I just don't know where to look and how you figure out what the fund balance and what it is that the rating agencies are looking at. And if we also include the two enterprise funds, because the two enterprise funds, I don't know what the debt is, but when we are thinking of the city's debt at 450, we have to add to it, which I think you did in your schedules, the enterprise debt. Is that correct?
Yes, I did. The 435 number included the enterprise fund debt.
Sorry. Go ahead, Ann.
435 includes the enterprise debt? Okay, well,
right.
Whatever. If we could just get a if we could get a schedule of how that all adds up, that would be great, because I can't find anywhere in the stuff that we've been given as to how to add that.
All right, and Bill, I assume you're pulling all these numbers from a combination of the annual report and the audit, right?
That's right, yes.
All right.
Yeah. So if we could just, I'd just like to see, and I'd like to also see how these metrics are just what the numbers are behind them, like available fund balance ratio, liquidity ratio, and how that might compare to AAA comps in our area, or what Moody's is looking for. So just that's in terms of the numbers. So here's a question on the band notes. So when you talked about Darien funding the Great Island land acquisition, it was a combination of bonds and short-term notes. When you said short-term notes, you were talking about these bond anticipation notes, correct?
Yes.
Okay. My understanding is that the interest can be capitalized and therefore rolled forward. So the capitalized interest does not necessarily go into our debt service calculation. Is that correct?
Yes, statutorily, you're correct. Statutorily, you can absolutely do that, and we do that on large school projects very often. Both the examples I gave you, Groton and Guilford, we did do that. It just requires the inclusion of that in the initial project budget, or in some kind of subsequent authorization. So what we want to be cognizant of is, if it's a $70 million project and we didn't contemplate capitalizing interest, we don't want to have to sacrifice bricks and mortar to cover the capitalized cost. So that's just something to think in mind. But yes, you're correct. You have the ability to do that, and it would not hit the operating budget until it's bonded.
I think our intention would be to pay the interest on the bands out of the operating budget.
Okay.
And it would be, I know Bill made the reference to Darien. I think the dollar amounts would be significantly less than that, as we're, either picking up the tail of some of these construction projects, or maybe a quarter's worth of construction payments that we would need to finance on a temporary basis. And so the dollar amounts would be significantly less than that.
So Jared, what do you anticipate we would need in terms of short-term financing for the I went back and I looked at the authorized CapEx, and I don't know if this has been spent or whatever, but if I go back to 2017, there's one which is school unnamed, 43.3 million, and then Nathaniel Ely at 41.9. And then in 2021, we authorized New Cranberry at 45 million and the Norwalk High School at 50.3. And I'm presuming that is our share of the overall cost of building these schools. So then we also now have the liquidity aspect between our payments to the vendors and our payments from the state. So what is the level of bonding do you think is necessary?
So we, that's something that we're looking at now and talking to our consultants, our construction consultants, so that we know the cash flow. And I can give you one example with regard to the South Norwalk School, South Norwalk Neighborhood School. There's there'll be some amount of bonding, roughly, roughly half of that we would end up bonding, and we'd probably have to take 5% of the total amount and 5 to 10% of that, and use bands to cover the amount that we would be awaiting from the state to be reimbursed. Just to give you a sense of magnitude, we haven't done the precise calculations yet, but just to give you a sense of what that might be in a year.
But right now I'm looking at these 4 school projects that are roughly 180 million. How much of that has already been spent and how much will be spent?
Again, those are things that we're collecting right now, and we'll come back to you guys, in a month or so, and be able to give you all of those details about what's been spent, the timing of what we still need to spend, and have a better sense of what that timing would look like.
Okay.
Jared, we have Alan Lowe on the line. He can probably at least give us the total expectation for each of the schools. Alan, you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah, so just refresh our memory on what the total budget is for South.
Sure.
Please.
I didn't get exactly which Annie is talking about, but for Pona School was $44 million, I believe. And that project is finished three years ago. All the money is spent. I think before I get into a little more detail, I think the first thing we realize is that previous project, the reimbursable rate is 22% for new construction. Okay. It's very different from the North High School and South North School. North High School 80%. It's a great number for the city for reimbursement, but it creates a cash flow issue. So I'll explain that a little later. So again, back to your question, I think I'm answering it correctly. For Ponus, it's about $44 million. All that project is finished. We are waiting to anticipate reimbursement. They're holding back 5% of the state share for that project. On Jefferson School, we are about to close the project. The project is finished. We spent all the funds. I think that was a $33 or $35 million project. We have actually left over $3 million, which we transferred out with a special appropriation for these intersection improvement and things like that in South Norwalk, and intersection improvement and drainage improvement. So that project spent, the reimbursement is 22%. And they are holding back for another 5%. We haven't closed the project yet. We're in the process of closing it. The problem is the state audit takes about 3 to 5 years. So that 5%, we were carrying it, but because it's only 20% reimbursement and 5% of that, we typically, and I don't know the financial arrangement the city have, but the city can manage that, carrying that cost somehow. I don't know how, but it's not a substantial amount compared to an 80% reimbursement at 5%, So that one, Cranberry School right now, it's a $45 million project. We should be, I think we have some residual money. We are near completion. It's still under construction. We should be finished in another month or two. We should be, $45 million, I think would be around $44 million. So we maybe have $1 million left at the end of the day. And that's a 22% reimbursement. So again, somehow we might have bonded all the city share already. And we have to carry the 5% of the 22% for another 3 to 5 years. Again, we're looking at a way to expedite the state's auditing process, but they are not that quick. That's the problem. So more importantly, on North High School, this is the issue here, because it's like $200+ million project. The city did not authorize the $200-somewhat million. Or we authorize the city share, which is about $50 million, which is 80% of the $200-somewhat million. So the problem here is that our $50 million can carry our construction for a few months here, a year here. But then we have to wait for state reimbursement to reimburse our account. But at some point, we don't have enough cash to flow the project because the state reimbursement doesn't come back fast enough. So that's the problem. I think the ban would be is a solution to this cash flow problem, because the state reimbursement is so high, it creates this cash flow problem for us. Okay. Similarly, South North School, we are authorized for full amount of $76 million. So when you saw like Ely School, we actually combined those numbers. I forgot what the number was. We combined that number, another number together to come up $76 million for South North School. We are fully authorized. When we first authorized this project, we were under the assumption that we're getting 22% reimbursement. But since then, the state has changed the special legislation. We are a 60% reimbursement community. So we are in a better financial position than we were when we first initiated the $76 million for South North School. However, because 60%, it does create a cash flow problem again for us. And then the band would help us to carry these projects through. So it's complicated somewhat, but I think the band will really help us in the sense that we are it's not a bad cash flow issue. We have to get, this traditionally it's not a big deal when we request a state for reimbursement because that, it's not a lot of money, but here it's a lot of money. So we always feel that the state can be able to reimburse it every 2 months. But recently, when I look at around the state, they're not meeting those 2 month schedule. So that creates more of a burden on the community to finance the state portion of the reimbursement for interim cash flow issues. So I think this ban would really help us.
Okay, so if we take the South Norwalk School at 76 million, and you expect to expend all those funds by September because you're going to be open by September, correct?
It's scheduled next year.
Yeah, 2025. And so let's say it's 3 months. We have a 3-month delay between what we pay out and what we get back from the state. So theoretically, 3 months would be, we would have to carry as working capital like $4 or $5 million.
Yes, it's not the full state share. So yeah, it's something that we are doing cash flow projection with our construction manager, and we are working on those numbers. So again, like 76 million as 60, roughly 50%. It's city share is like $38 million kind of thing. We're not going to borrow short term for $38 million. We will have to carry from month to month kind of thing, So we don't know what the number is. Could be $5 million, maybe that's all we need to carry, or $10 million to carry. And it is stopped by the end of the construction period. We need to carry some money for the 5% retainage of the state share after the project is completed. Does this all make sense?
Yeah, no, I get it.
Okay.
This may be already built into the contract, but is it possible to extend our days payable by 30 days?
I didn't hear that. Sorry, say it again.
It may be already built into the contract as to what our payment to our vendors, the terms are, but can we extend that by 30 days? So instead of paying them immediately when we get the bill, we wait 30 days and pay them 30 days later. So for example, one of the best run companies in the United States was General Electric, and they said, okay, if you are going to be our customer, we're going to pay you in 120 days. So the vendor is carrying part of that working capital cost, just like we're carrying part of the working capital cost for the city.
I didn't hear you correctly, but I assume your question is like delay payment to the contractors. There's a few right away. I think
that'd be possible, or what?
No, there's a few issue. When these projects are bid out, there's a state statute that requires to pay contractor within 30 days. Okay, that's one thing. Secondly, is that if that is the criteria that we can delay the payment, we do that. When the contract bid it, they will bid higher amounts just to cover their debt service for that month, for the additional 30 days. So they're bidding to the city is based on 30-day payment. So if you want to extend it, sure, then we have to pay the interest payment to them. So it doesn't really save us some money. And the third thing is that when contract, we get monthly requisition. So they do work for 1 month, and they submit a requisition for us. Then we have to go through this whole process of review, go back and forth for like 2 weeks or so. By the time we actually process this payment, it's like from the time they finish, it's a month already, a month and a half. So extending that, it's not really fair, and then, you know, it's not going to work because they have to pay the employees, right? And material and stuff like that. So yeah, I don't want to go any further, but generally speaking, no.
All right, so the looming expenditures is a full 76 for South Norwalk and the 200 plus for the high school, correct?
Right.
Mr. Lindsay, can we go back to these ban notes? What is the spread? What is the how much of a premium do we pay in the spread, or do we pay a premium at all to do the bans in terms of interest rates?
That's a good question. Unfortunately, with the inverted yield curve we have right now, the ban rate is about equivalent to what your 20-year bond rate would be.
Right.
So from that perspective, you know, you'd want to bond it, right? But that, you know, once the Fed starts cutting, the hope would be that the inversion, you know, the curve flattens in the short end, and we take out some of that inversion. That's the one drawback currently with using the short-term notes, is that from a historic perspective, rates are pretty high. But again, we're trying, you know, there's a certain cost that, you know, it's just, if we're trying to maintain the city's rating and get these projects completed, necessary projects get completed, you know, that higher rate of interest on the short-term notes, you know, may be worth paying.
So if we were to go out, say, in July, and interest rates all being equal, that we have no easing, at what rates would we hypothetically issue 30-year debt and the bans?
Yeah, so right now, short-term rates are about 3.60, 3.5 to 3 5/8. The 30-year rate is we still have a positive sloping yield curve when you get like 10 years and out. So right now the 30-year rate's about a 3.90. So there is maybe a 30 basis point difference between the 1-year rate and the 30-year rate. So you are paying less on the bands as when we look at a 30-year bond issuance.
Right.
But historically, that rate's probably closer to 150 basis points if the curve is to be a positive sloping, traditional yield curve.
Right. Well, conceivably, if when we go to refund and refinance the bans, hopefully interest rates would be lower, so we could reissue at 3.4, like we might have done historically.
Right, and that's also a very good point. I know the question came up on interest rates earlier. I mean, again, inflation is proven to be stubborn, and the timing of the Fed cuts keeps getting pushed out, right? But I think the general consensus is a year from now, let's say, rates are expected to be lower. Can't guarantee that, but that's the reasonable expectation. So there's one advantage there. The point you just made is if we're going to go out and borrow for part of the cost a year out, permanently finance those costs a year out, the expectation is that rates should be lower. We unfortunately can't guarantee that, but it's a good point.
I guess what I'd like to just do here, and is, I don't want to. I'm disrupting you for a minute. I'll come back to your question, but I want to remind us, right, that what we're doing, what we're talking about here, this is the role that Jared has to play, and the finance department has to play with Bill, with others, to solve for a lot of the things we're talking about. Jared's already said he wants 30 days or so to work through this. So I would ask that, again, you ask the questions we need for clarity here, but this is not a problem-solving session, and I just want to set that expectation, please.
Mr. Chairman, I just have to say that I appreciate the dialogue that Ann is running, and I think it's been very helpful, and I would ask her to continue. Thank you.
Not suggesting she's not, just making sure we don't try and get into problem solving, because we cannot tonight.
Well, I'm trying to understand what it is, if bans is a good thing or a bad thing.
Yep.
Okay, and knowing the interest rates on them and the amortization and how we do it can tell me how, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing for us to do.
Understood.
Mr. Lindsay, is there any, when you look at the credit ratings with the bands and the long-term bonds, there's no difference. Debt is debt. Is that correct?
Yes, yes. From a credit perspective, yes.
And when we look at our debt, when Moody's looks at the OPEB and the pension, do we actually get kind of almost one-for-one credit? So if we're overfunded by $1 million, is that kind of count? Can we net that from our debt amount?
No, unfortunately, it did not. No, because there's two metrics here. The metrics that they're using, there's two of them. One of them is they're taking the total liability, and it is a net liability. So in a sense, yes, and the pension and OPEB, to the extent that the asset value goes up and the liability faster than the liability does, the net liability comes down, and that's what they're measuring. So for both the overall amount of cost of the liability, the dollar amount of the liability versus revenues, yes, overfunded. Yeah, you could say that it would be that way, dollar for dollar, where you're overfunded would offset, because they do take the net number. The second piece, though, is a carrying charge measurement. So it's the annual contribution, right, towards pension, OPEB, and then annual debt service, inclusive of interest this time, and what that carrying charge is. So to the extent that you're overfunded and it brings down the ADEC, then yes, that is going to help reduce those metrics in your favor.
Right. So if we do look at the ADEC as a percentage of the operating budget, assuming that we keep a flat operating budget and we don't increase the denominator, we're I think in one of your memos we're at maybe 9.3%, and maybe the metric that people are looking at is 10%. I don't know where we are in that metric, but if we're issuing, this is where the question of capitalizing the interest costs might come in. Because if we capitalize it, it doesn't go into the annual debt service number, or does it?
If you capitalized it, it would not until you issued the bonds. If that was the decision.
Right, the replacement bonds.
Yes. Yep.
Got it. Could we go back, Tom, to the slide where we look at the projected debt amounts? I think it was it there, the debt waterfall?
Slide 12, the other water.
Yep, the green one, yes.
Okay, so we historically have reduced our debt load by 30 to 35 million. And that's from free cash flow that we have from operations. And the increase to 40 and 45 is just because that's what the load is going to be as we increase debt. We have just higher payments. So does that sort of beg the question that the best way to look at where we should keep our capital expenditures is to have it be close to what our free cash flow is?
I mean, that would certainly keep the debt load at a constant amount.
Right.
Yep.
Okay. Because this shows that we kind of make it through this year, but when we come to next year in 2025, we're getting pretty tight.
Right. Yeah, and again, I think to Jared's comments earlier is that this is, I would expect this to be smoothed out. It wouldn't be quite as lumpy, as it is here. Is borrowing heavy in 25, in 26 and 27. Again, you've got two $50 million school projects in each of those 2 years that aren't going to get built in a year. I wouldn't expect. And so, I do believe that new capital borrowing amount will be reduced, pushed out. And to the extent that it drops to closer to 50 million in 28 through 31, to the extent that you spread that out, it slows the growth rate of that ending balance. But yeah, but I think your approach is fair, is correct.
Okay. Do we issue, is most of our debt level debt service, or is it level principal?
That's a great question. It's been level principal. And the reason is that it saves on the interest expense. What that tends to do, it tends to have a more immediate impact, rather than in the near term. So the year or two after you issuance is kind of the peak year of debt service. And so that is the offset to the lower interest expense. But in an effort to keep interest expense at a minimum, we've gone with level principal. It's a faster rate of repayment.
Would it make sense for us to go to level payment in the next couple of years?
It's something we can look at. The 30-year amortization with level principal and interest, it doubles the amount of interest expense you pay over the life of the loan. And so that's been what my concern has been, just the sheer dollar amount, increased dollar amount over the life of the loan. It's a lot. And so that hasn't been my preference. But it's something that we look at every time we go to issue. And so, it's something that it has been considered and will be considered for August or July, August, whenever the city comes back to market. I just, the other thing that, what the other concern I have just off the top of my head is that where we believe to have currently a fair amount of debt forthcoming, to the extent that we are switching to a level P&I, it pushes out, it slows down the rate of repayment, it pushes the principal out into the future. And then we don't have these drops in the existing debt profile that we can kind of target with new borrowings. So one of the advantages of using the short-term notes is we can extend when the debt comes, hits the mill rate or hits the operating budget. We can look at the debt profile and say, hey, you've got an upcoming drop in this year. We can try to structure it to level off the budgeted amount. Kind of lose that flexibility with a level P&I.
Right.
Yeah, Bill, and real quick, I like that. We've been using the level of principal payment, repayment amount, and I like that approach. I know as a former banker, that was the quickest way for us, the most quickest way to get repaid. And if we're using that already, I appreciate that. And there is a savings of interest there.
Okay. I only say that because, we've got some lean years coming ahead. And I know that other towns have gone to level debt service in a way so that they are better able to predict their costs.
Mm.
But again, I just asked the question. It's you and Jared to decide at the time of issuance. What is the shortest term capital expenditure you feel that we can bond?
I think 5 years is a good measuring stick. We do. Well, I guess let me ask you a question. When you say shortest measure to bond, you mean the useful life of the asset we're financing? or the amortization term?
The useful life. So, I mean, here's the question. In our capital budget, there has been a lot of discussion, both at the Common Council level and at the planning and zoning level, that some of these items in the capital budget look more like operating expenses. And if they look more like operating expenses, I don't think that means we can really bond them. So I just want to highlight that. I just want to, because if you're saying kind of 5 years, we should be looking at, to bond, we should look at assets like fire trucks, land, schools to bond, and not things like, something that has a much shorter useful life.
Right. I would agree with you in theory. That we do, we do have clients who do things that are 2 or 3 years, but I'd say that's maybe the exception rather than the rule. We do have, technology is the one thing that comes to mind, or police vehicles for that matter, tend to be like a 5-year amortization, and we see that a lot. And what we can do is we can kind of build the amortization, maybe from the ground up instead of from the top down, where we look at this is what the city's historically done, looked at the useful life of the asset and said, okay, here are the 10, 5, if that's the case, but here are the 10-year and the 20 and then the 30-year assets. And we've gone with level principal for 10 and level principal for 20 and level principal for 30. And then it's rolled up to be a kind of a declining amortization, again, with the idea that we're matching the useful life of the asset to the term of the borrowing. 1, 2, when it's level, we're reducing the interest expense.
Great, thank you. The other question that I have is in this economic growth factor, which is out of our control, so to speak, and we're amalgamated with Bridgeport and other cities. Is that a number that's declining, or are we getting any better here in Connecticut?
Yeah, that's a great question. It has been improving. It has been. The problem is just we're not matching the growth of the country at large, or haven't been, and so that's the problem. It has gotten better, definitely. And to the extent that and again, it's a 5-year measure, which is part of the reason why I don't really love this metric. They take what it was last year and they go back to 5 years ago. It's been growing, and to the extent that we get beyond COVID and get COVID out of the calculation, I think is going to help. But Connecticut is Connecticut. It's a mature community, and we don't have that. We're not going to be able to keep up with Texas or the Southwest or some of these other areas where you have land available to build factories and things like that. It's just not. It's not my favorite metric, to be quite honest.
Well, it's fair from an investor's standpoint. They're measuring: do I buy a Connecticut bond or do I buy a Texas bond?
Right. Yep.
I noticed that in one of your memos that we don't have any notching factors. And when I looked at the notching factors, it seemed like the one which could come into consideration is the potential for significant change in leverage. Is that at all a potential issue?
It could be, and that's something we need to keep in mind. Again, Moody's has only had this methodology out on the street for about a year. They've yet to use that notching factor for any of our clients or anyone in Connecticut. And that includes, some pretty healthy capital plans. Like Greenwich comes to mind. It's almost $1 billion. It's a 12-year plan. It's not a 5-year plan. It's actually a 20-year plan. It's a longer plan, but again, they've got a very large budget and it's really a city, right? It's not a town. I don't know this is fair, just given the size of it, but they have not introduced that one factor yet. But yes, your point is that would be the one I would be concerned with as well.
Right, okay. Now, I understand that Moody's is going to a metric of looking at 20% sort of available cash over operating expenses. And I don't know how they define available cash. It's into the liquidity, meaning they're looking at a higher liquidity ratio.
Right, and so yeah, that's what they're doing. They're looking at both cash and investments.
Okay.
And they're comparing that to total governmental funds revenues on a GAAP basis. And so that's their approach. And so the last few years have been helpful because you've got things like ARPA funding that didn't get spent immediately, that are you have a obviously you're coming up to that spending or the allocation deadline, but the money didn't go out the door immediately. And so to the extent that you've got better liquidity there has been helpful to everybody, but that's, it's ending, right? So there's that consideration as well.
Thank you. That's all I have for now, but I really appreciate your presentation and your really solid advice. And I feel like we're in very safe hands with you as our advisor.
Good. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, just one more quick question. On your letter, on Henry's letter last year, the transmittal letter dated January 31st, 2023, we see that paragraph where you describe the capital. I think that's what Ann was talking about, the capital assets under the use of bonds for funding. And in your description, Tom, or Henry's, it says our capital budget is comprised of projects in which we acquire or construct capital assets. The city defines capital assets as those that have a useful life of more than 1 year and whose cost exceeds $5,000. And Bill, that seems a little, that doesn't really sound like it. That doesn't sort of a true capital budget type of definition.
Yeah, I mean, it's a policy decision, right? So each community is going to define that differently. So I don't know that it's my place to necessarily say that's appropriate or inappropriate. I think, again, to the extent that you have a certain amount of pay-go capital, say in the budget for smaller dollar amounts, or it could be shorter useful life assets, it does provide you with a certain degree of financial flexibility in the sense that in an emergency or a storm, whatever, you could defer those capital expenditures because they're under your control, and you could you could use that funding for some other reason. But I don't know that it's my place to necessarily say that the policy is inappropriate. It's just different people have different dollar thresholds, and different communities have different term thresholds. 5 years is the one that I probably see the most common.
Thank you for that. And I would just mention to Jarrett and to Tom that I prefer to stay more on the 3 to 5 years.
Yeah, I'll remind this group that as a BET, we did make the recommendation during our operating budget reviews.
Okay, great.
To reevaluate the way in which we look at and define capital budget for the city, and that's with Tom and the administration to take up.
And my final question: how many cities have AAA rating in the state out of the 169?
That's a great
roughly.
Yeah, so if we're talking about Moody's, it's 16.
16 out of 106 out of 106.
Yeah, with Moody's rating. Standard & Poor's number is higher than that. And unfortunately, I don't have it in front of me. I want it off the top of my head. It's like 23 to 25 when we look at Standard & Poor's. Again, Standard & Poor's, as I said in the presentation, their methodology is a little more flexible, or a little more. It favors communities that are well run and have good management, and those that do are going to score better because of that 20% weighting. And so there's a higher number of AAAs with S&P than there is with Moody's.
And what is the state of Connecticut?
So the state's rating is AA now,
Okay.
almost across the board. Yeah,
So we're helping the
It's
city.
improved, right, but it's not at the level of the city.
Let me just say this in closing. Bill, this was great. We're going through obviously a very interesting state move right now, and I appreciate the time you've given us, and you've given me a lot more comfort than we had on April 1st. And I really appreciate your time, and thank you.
My pleasure.
And it looked like you wanted to make a comment before we close.
Yeah, I just had one simple question, which is, if we were to drop a notch, what is the basis? What's the additional cost in terms of interest rate borrowings? Is it 20 basis points?
Yeah, we get this question all the time, and it's in terms of the spread, it's pretty tight right now. It's about 10 basis points. Again, that's elastic. It's not a static number. It varies based on the economic cycle and credit conditions. But I'll say this: it's more about the loss in prestige. I think far outweighs the financial cost. To be able to say to prospective businesses or homeowners, "Hey, listen, we don't just think that Norwalk's a great city. These Wall Street people think it's a great city as well." I think that's really what the benefit is. And so, but yeah, it's a lot less than I think than people intuitively would guess.
Right, but it impacts the management performance metric.
It does. Yeah.
Okay. And I just want to make one other comment relative to these capital expenditures. I did read in the budget, capital expenditures are defined in the Newark City Code as items that cost at least $10,000 and have a useful life of 10 years or more. So I just wanted to offer that.
As thanks, it points out the fact that we're all over the place at the moment, and we need to get consistency and clarity as we requested. Okay. Bill,
thank you.
Like my fellow board members, I thank you for your time. I thank you for the confidence that you instill upon us. It was very helpful. And I thank you for the detailed questions. I think it helped educate everyone. That
Mr.
said,
Chairman, I think Tom Ellis wants
Yeah.
to say something, if you don't mind.
Wanted to clarify one thing because it's important, Bill, and I perhaps I misheard, but I thought I heard conflicting guidance on this. But if we do end up issuing any of the bans, that does or does not count towards what is currently the $500 million limit and soon to be $650 million limit.
Yeah, it does count towards it. It would be included. It'll be on the it'll be included in there, where it's the use of the notes is less for a credit motivation or a credit use. It's more a budgetary and cash flow use. So that's where the benefit is in not soaking up the city's internal liquidity for a longer period of time, as Alan indicated, with this taking the state a while to do these post-project closeouts, and then it's to push forward the budgetary impact of the debt service on the long-term bonds.
Gotcha. Okay. An interesting point on the prestige of the ratings. It's we get intrinsic rewards, don't we?
Yep. Yes, we did. All right. So, Jared, Tom, we will look to you to continue the conversations with Bill, come back to the PT in a timely fashion with your update and final recommendations. I'm not going to put a specific time frame on it, Jared. I know you're still getting your feet under you, but we'll checkpoint in on it in the next 30 days and reevaluate them. Before I close, Mr. Mayor, any remarks?
No, thank you. Just want to thank everybody for their time. And Bill, you did a great job. Appreciate the time you've given us. I know the evening gets late, but you're a true trooper. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you, Mayor.
Thanks, Bill.
With that, can I get a motion to adjourn, please?
So moved, if nobody else will.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. We are adjourned. Have a nice evening, everyone.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Good night.